Hello everyone, welcome to Evolutionary Biology class, and we are in Unit 3, which is Sources of Variation, and the topic for today is Modes of Speciation and Adaptive Radiation. So what is speciation? Speciation is a linear splitting evolutionary process that produces two or more separate species. So it refers to the creation of new and distinct biological species by branching off from the ancestral population. It occurs when gene flow is reduced sufficiently between sister population to allow each to become irrevocably committed to different evolutionary lineages. So reduced gene flow probably plays a critical role in speciation. Various modes have been presented whereby a single evolutionary lineage splits into two or more genetically independent lineages due to reduced gene flow. So modes of speciation are often classified as Allopatric, Sympatric and Parapatric speciation. So what is allopatric speciation? In 1963, Ernest Mayr contended that speciation takes place through allopatry or geographic isolation. So allopatric speciation, the term means allo means other and patric means place. So other place or geographical differences. So allopatric speciation is a genetic divergence permitted by geographical isolation. So this process is dependent on random mutation which accumulates steadily after the population has been subdivided in space. And this subdivision can take place because of geographic barriers such as mountain ranges and water bodies. Since the two subpopulations are then reproductively isolated, each of the population accumulates in different mutations and the two populations diverge. So this divergence is the strongest where the population size of one or both of the subpopulation is small because sampling error is higher in smaller population. So these differences will eventually lead to reproductive incompatibilities that will be keeping the population distinct. So one of the well-known example of allopatric speciation involves divergence of Drosophila populations in Hawaiian archipelago. So reproductive isolating mechanism usually originate incidentally in the speciation process. So that is, they arise incidentally during the process of evolution in isolated population rather than being selected for. So when isolated population come together again, incomplete isolating mechanism may allow hybrids to form. So if the hybrids are normal, viable and can freely interbreed with individuals of each parent population, then no speciation has taken place. So for the speciation to take place, the two populations once they have separated from each other and again when they come back they should not interbreed and form a hybrid. However, if the hybrids are at a disadvantage, natural selection may favor stronger isolating mechanisms. So in this case, organisms that mate with individuals from other populations leave very fewer offspring. So the result is a more effective barrier to hybridization. Regions in which previously isolated populations come into contact and produce hybrids are called hybrid zones. So here is a simplified flow chart of allopatric speciation. So single interbreeding population in the beginning, they get geographically isolated and they become two different populations. So because of the geographical isolation, and then once two populations are at a different geographical regions, there is an increased genetic divergence among geographically isolated populations by means of genetic drift and selection. So because of this genetic drift and selection, the selection for increased reproductive isolation takes place, and then these two population finally becomes two new species, and then when the two population becomes completely new, two different species, we say that the speciation has been completed. Next is the sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation, the term means sym means same, patric means place. So sympatric speciation conversely does not require geographic isolation or geographical barriers as in the allopatric speciation. Instead, it relies on the development of reproductive isolation mechanism to allow divergence of the two subpopulations. So here the same population divides into two subpopulations and transforms itself into two new species because of the reproductive isolating mechanism and not just because of the geographical barrier. So this reproductive isolation can be a result of a number of factors including competition for resources, disruptive selection and sexual selection. So in sympatric speciation, selection acts against individual of an intermediate type either through decreased viability or decreased fecundity. Viability means inability of the young ones to develop into a mature individual, and decreased fecundity means decrease in the number of eggs or offsprings. So this creates the evolution of mating preferences and other mechanisms that result in decreased hybridization. So in sympatric speciation, selection enhances traits that promote the divergence of the population. So this is fundamentally different from allopatric speciation, where mutation passively leads to differences that allow divergence of the populations. So probably the best known example of this sympatric speciation is the divergence of the Regulatis pulmonella, which is the maggot fly. So this species, Regulatis pulmonella, has recently diverged into two subspecies due to the introduction of apple trees in the northeastern United States, where previously there were only hawthorn trees. So initially the flies used the hawthorn fruits to produce and to lay their eggs. So the introduction of the apple trees provided a more nutritious food source for developing maggots, as well as an escape from parasitic wasps. So the difference between the two types of fruits, such as maturation timing, allowed for the evolution of isolating mechanism and subsequent divergence into two subspecies. So here is the subspecies of the Pulmonella maggot fly, which has been living in the newly introduced apple trees, and this is how they live inside the apple tree and lay their eggs, which turns into maggots. So this is a simplified flow chart of sympatric speciation. So here a single interpreting population gets separated because of the ecological isolation in the same place. So this leads to increased genetic divergence among ecologically isolated population by means of genetic drift and selection, and here selection for increased reproductive isolation takes place, and finally the single interpreting population divides into two new species or subspecies, and hence this speciation is completed. Now finally the parapatric speciation. Parapatric speciation means that para means beside, patric means place. So parapatric speciation is a formal speciation in which the evolution of reproductive isolating mechanism occurs when a population enters a new niche or habitat within the range of the parent species. So generally this occurs when there has been a drastic change in the environment within the original species habitat. So in parapatric speciation, there is no specific extrinsic barrier to gene flow. So the population is continuous, but nonetheless the population does not mate randomly. Individuals are more likely to mate with their geographical neighbors than with individuals in different parts of the population range. So in this mode, divergence may happen because of reduced gene flow within the population and varying selection pressure across the population's range. So this is the figure showing how four different modes of speciation. So the most common three are the allopatric speciation, parapatric speciation, and the sympatric speciation. So in allopatric speciation, reproductive isolation evolves after the population has been geographically isolated, and whereas in the parapatric speciation, reproductive isolation evolves when a segment of the population enters a new niche, and in sympatric speciation, reproductive isolation evolves while the incipient group is still in the vicinity of the parent population. And with this we come to the end of the modes of speciation. Now let us move to adaptive radiation. So natural selection can ultimately lead to the formation of new species. Sometimes many species evolve from a single ancestral species. So such an evolutionary pattern in which many related species evolved from a single ancestral species is called as adaptive radiation. So multiple species that has been formed from the single ancestral species, so this process is known as the adaptive radiation. So in an adaptive radiation, or often just known as radiation, it means that a smaller number of ancestral species in one taxon diversifies into a large number of descendant species occupying a broader range of ecological niche. So adaptive radiation most commonly occurs when a species of organism successfully invades an isolated region where a few competing species exist. So it can occur at all taxonomic levels. So when an ancestral population invades another region and it diversifies according to the geographical areas, so then forms a multiple species, this process is known as adaptive radiation. A good example is the Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. where a single ancestor has evolved into a different species with a range of ecological adaptation. So altogether there are 14 species of Darwin finches on the Galapagos Islands now, each filling a different niche on different islands. So all of them evolved from one ancestral species which colonized the islands only a few million years ago. So the ancestral finch which invaded the Galapagos Island was originally the ground-dwelling seed-eating finch. And here in this picture we can see how the seed-eating ancestral finch diversified itself into multiple new species according to the habitat of the different islands. So because the Galapagos Island is a group of islands. So another interesting example in which one species give rise to multiple species that exploit different niches is the fruit flies on the Hawaiian Islands. So they have radiated into hundreds of species. So this is the figure showing that how an ancestral fruit fly has diversified into hundreds of new species in these Hawaiian Islands. So these adaptive radiations can occur in a number of circumstances. So most importantly, there are two circumstances which are colonization of the new area where there are no competitors and the extinction of the competitors. So what do you mean by colonization of new areas? So adaptive radiation of fruit flies, lizards and finches on islands all occurred after ancestral species colonized the respective areas. Probably there were no competitors present because the islands had only recently emerged from the sea or the lakes had only recently been flooded. So the areas all contain unexploited resources and the ancestral species radiate into a range of forms that could exploit those resources. And second is the extinction of competitors may be the another reason. So the adaptive radiation of mammals followed the extinction of the dinosaurs. So when there was an extinction of dinosaurs, the place that were occupied by the dinosaurs were vacated. So this ecological space was vacated, which were then later occupied by the mammals. And in turn, these mammals diversified into multiple species to use the different resources of that place. So with this also the divergence can take place and multiple species can form. So these are the two reasons how adaptive radiation from a single species can take place. And with this we come to the end of this class. Thank you for listening. Please like, share and subscribe to the channel for getting notified for the upcoming classes. Thank you.